Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibiers. Welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. Good to have you here. It's Wednesday, January 7th. Kouri Richins had day one of this evidentiary hearing today. And before I get started, I just want to give you a heads up. The judge said that day two will not be live streamed due to the fact it pertains to things that were filed under seal regarding some evidence that they want brought in. So we will not have a day two of this hearing. Kind of a bummer, but it is what it is. Today's issues were essentially the defense wanting to keep out 3 of the state's experts from testifying at Kouri's trial, which starts next month. They bring in Dr. Fox, who is a defense witness, and she talks about the pathway to violence, which is what the state's witness wants to bring in. And we'll get into the meaning of this in a second, but Dr. Fox said this is not a reliable scientific method, and it shouldn't be brought into trial through the state's expert, Dr. Ammon. The pathway to violence model is a group-based descriptive framework that outlines sequences or phases of behavior observed retrospectively, and this is almost exclusively applied to people that commit targeted acts of violence such as mass shootings or terrorist attacks. It's not a diagnostic tool, and it can't be applied to individual cases. Aside from that, it's pure theory with no scientific testing. It was created with data, and it was developed by people with no scientific training. It wasn't designed to predict or diagnose whether a person will commit violence. A predictive risk assessment, you want to forecast individual outcomes before they occur. The pathway to violence doesn't tell the likelihood that someone will engage in violence, and that is a major flaw of it. There's no estimates for likelihood, probability, there's no statistics behind it, and there is no error rate. It's not a diagnostic instrument, and it's not designed to be applied to individual cases. She explains the model is a theory. It's not scientific. The model has not undergone any testing. There's a lack of validation studies, and it doesn't meet the standards of a predictive risk assessment. So what does this model do? It summarizes patterns observed across groups of individuals after violent acts have taken place. There's limited investigative value when you're reviewing events in retrospect, but they also can't be used to predict future behavior. They're not reliable to support conclusions about whether a specific person is likely to commit violence. Applying this model to an individual case really amounts to profiling rather than a legitimate scientific assessment. And the witness said the distinction is critical. Predictive risk assessments are designed to estimate the likelihood that a person will engage in violent behavior before it occurs. This risk assessment relies on validated data, known accuracy rates, and measurable error rates. The pathway to violence model doesn't have any of this. There's no probability estimates, no statistics to support it, and no known rate of false positives or false negatives. And without that kind of data, there's no way to determine how often the model applies or fails to apply in real-world cases. It just cannot assess risk or likelihood. It doesn't quantify probability, it doesn't offer predictive metrics, and it provides no scientifically established error rate. And that is a big limitation of this model. The pathway to violence also fails to meet the standards that are required under Rule 702. So what is Utah Rule of Evidence 702? It revolves around expert testimony, and it controls when an expert is allowed to testify and what kind of opinions they can offer. It ensures expert testimony is reliable, relevant, and helpful, and not junk science or speculation. Also, the pathway to violence has never been published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. In Ms. Ammon's proffer, the model was referenced only one time in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, but even being mentioned in that journal, it doesn't mean it had any scientific validation. What would matter is if it had been published in a peer-review publication, which is a big indicator of scientific reliability. The fact that it hasn't been in a peer-reviewed publication, it's huge, and it underscores the model's lack of scientific foundation. The pathway to violence lacks a standardized methodology. There's no manual to go by, no defined criteria, and no objective standards governing its application. For an example, what one evaluator may say is a grievance, another may not. The evaluators aren't required to apply any uniform standard across cases, and there's no requirement for these validators to determine these things using the same criteria. So two professionals can reach entirely different conclusions, even though they're reviewing the same information. She gives an example of how this is not scientifically reliable. She says you use your home scale to weigh yourself versus the doctor's office, and you get two different results. So that's not reliable. But you would expect they would say the same thing. So if you stand on the same scale twice a day and your weight is the same, no big deal. But if you stand on it twice a day and you get different results, most likely there's a problem with the scale and that scale is not reliable. What's important is that two people look at the same case and agree this person meets certain criteria. The witness said she would argue this is not reliable and there's no known error rate, and that's a problem because it has the ability to produce false positives. As far as admissibility, there's no known error rate, so the court cannot assess the reliability of this method. And the model has never been applied to identify individuals who do go on to commit violence. The pathway to violence isn't based on data. It's based on intuition, educated guesswork, and hunches. And it's not valid to use the pathway to violence model after a violent act has occurred. She said it's like predicting the lottery numbers after the drawing has occurred. And for example, she said you could look at the 9/11 attackers and say they all fit the same profile. But to do that retroactively, there's 55 million people plus who do fit that profile. But those who actually go on to do something like the 9/11 attacks is basically 0%. There's no validity, and many who fit that profile would never go on to commit the act. She also said it could be a violation of the person's rights to make that implication of them without even having a 1% accuracy rate. And the pathway to violence suffers that same flaw. Applying it could mean it applies to 1% of people. She gives the example, people are stressed at work. People have problems at home, but they would never go on to commit an act of violence. She said, due to the fact there is a high risk of false positives, among many other reasons, to enter that in as an expert opinion, she said she would feel very concerned about. She said acts of violence are very hard to predict with any reasonable accuracy because most acts of violence are emotional. They're not long thought out, premeditated acts. The defense asks if the pathway to violence was used to try and identify school shooters or mass shooters. Was it meant to be applied in a case like Kouri's? And the witness said no. She said, we think because it applies here, it should apply there. And there's fundamental differences between targeted attacks and radicalization. And this should not be admitted as something the jury can rely on. At this point, the judge asked if she went through the FBI Academy, and she did. He asked, were the pathways to violence taught there? And she says no. She has had no exposure to this in her career with the FBI. There are similar models like pathways to radicalization, and that's actually the area she worked in the FBI. For the next witness, the state called Dr. Ammon, who testified that the model is one of several tools they used in cases of targeted violence involving a specific person. She said it's a very critical part of their work and said the research behind this model dates back about 100 years. And also said the model is designed to prevent violence, not to predict it. The size of the target is irrelevant, and the model is widely accepted in the behavioral science community and is also supported by multiple studies. So what did the judge do? The judge partially granted the defense's request. He ruled that Dr. Ammon cannot testify as evidence of guilt or to rebut case-specific claims about whether or not Kouri committed the crime. But he did find she is qualified to testify, discussing retrospective studies as a blind expert. The next witness the defense wanted to block was a handwriting expert, Matt Throckmorton. Kouri faces 3 counts of forgery, and the state says this witness is absolutely qualified to determine whether Eric signed the documents or if his signature was forged. The judge noted the witness believes there is a strong probability the signature on an insurance document was unauthorized and forged by Kouri. So the judge denied the defense's request and he will be allowed to testify. The last witness the defense wanted to block is Dr. Sherry Veneno as an expert witness. The state wanted time to receive more evidence to show Eric knew Kouri was trying to poison him on Valentine's Day 2022. Once they get that evidence, it would strengthen this witness's testimony. The defense said that her expertise is primarily in domestic abuse cases, and there is no evidence of abuse in Eric and Kouri's relationship. The judge did rule her testimony was not currently relevant, but he did leave the door open, saying it could become admissible if the state presents sufficient evidence to support that Eric was aware of the alleged poisoning attempt. So for me, I feel like this whole predictive risk assessment was kind of a word salad. So I hope it come across in a way that didn't confuse the heck out of y'all. But that is it for today. I hope you guys have a good rest of your evening, and we will see you soon.